Hey everybody, welcome to All Good Stories podcast. Before we jump into our regularly scheduled programming, we want to give you a quick heads up. During the so what of it all in this episode, we're going to get to some real talk about Santa. And so we want to give you a heads up, especially if you're listening along with your kids. So we're going to give you a 10-second heads up. 10 seconds out from some real talk, you're going to hear the magical sound of sleigh bells, which is a great opportunity for you to either hit pause or fast forward later on. But just FYI, we're going to give you a heads up along the way, and you can make a decision then for yourself. All right, that's all we got for now. Enjoy the episode.
Well, I don't know, Scott. You're as healthy as a horse.
Yeah, Clydesdale.
Hello and welcome to the All Good Stories podcast, where we believe all good stories belong to Jesus. And when we look for Jesus in the stories around us, we find him more fully in our own. We're your hosts, Chris Bowden
and Simon Campbell, two millennial dads who love pop culture and making connections from the content we love to the God who loves us.
And in episode 20, we're going to spend some time with Scott Calvin, Kris Kringle, Sinterklaas, Pere Noel, Babbo Natale, Pelz-Nickel, and Topo Gigio as we find the good stories in the Santa Claus. Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to our Christmas movie series. As we move through the holiday season, we decided it would be great to dive into some Christmas movies because we think there are some great opportunities to connect those to Jesus. We've been in Spirited, we've been in Klaus, and now we're jumping into the one, the only, the Santa Claus, which will then be followed by... Just kidding. I'm not going to tell you. You're going to wait for that.
Every week.
Every week. I'm committed to the bit at this point. It's not fun for anyone else but me. But
like
I'm going to keep doing it.
I'm here for it. I like it.
Thanks. That means a lot. So, Simon, the movie The Santa Claus has become, I think, a staple Christmas movie for a lot of people.
Oh, yes.
I know in our household, this is one we try to get to every year, and one that I remember more of than I think I do.
No, this is a very memorable, very quotable movie. I would say this movie is so close in our hearts and our family that it actually transcends Christmas time. So this is a comfort movie in random times of the year. And particularly for me and my wife, we'll just sit down and we will watch The Santa Claus. This is one of the most quoted movies in our house, probably.
Okay, so if I were to ask you in real time here, what are like the top 3 quotes that you guys throw around your house?
The first one for sure is when he's shaving and he has dyed his hair and then his beard grows back. Suddenly he goes, "I'm in big trouble." So like that will come up randomly.
That's really good.
Particularly if our kids are doing something that we're like, "Oh, that was unexpected," and now that's going to be a thing. We're like, "I'm in big trouble."
That's good. I never would have snagged it as a quote from here. That's so great.
The other one, it's even more niche. In Denny's, when the waitress is like, "Well, at least we know they have apple pie." We did. Like it's whenever somebody's out of something, whether it's at a restaurant, a store, or whatever. And I don't think anybody else in the conversation gets it when we do that. But Tim Allen's little like they're out of that.
I love that there is an in both of your quotes.
Because we quote it so much. You know how your memory about a movie or whatever just all of a sudden comes to mind? The entrances, I think the longer you are dealing with the movie and the more familiar you are with it, the smaller those entrances become and the smaller the segments that trigger those memories. That's what's happened with us is like even just the we're talking about the Santa Claus.
So this is a staple movie for you.
This is a staple movie.
One of your big ones here for you and your family. Gosh, no pressure here all of a sudden. This is super exciting.
Yeah, and Tim Allen for some reason is also a big deal for us because we also love Christmas with the Cranks. Those are our top 2 Christmas movies, I think, for the two of us that we love watching.
Okay, stepping on hollowed ground. Take your sandals off, Simon. Here we go.
Yeah.
And this was Tim Allen's first movie role, if you can believe it. This was his first shot at the movies. And so previously he was known for his stand-up comedy and then was also known for his infamous role as Tim the Toolman Taylor.
Yes.
which started in 1991. So then comes this movie along in 1994, and then it continues for 8 seasons until 1999.
Wow.
Then right on the heels of that, he gets Toy Story. Buzz Lightyear, you know, and then he's just always been in the conversation for like Hollywood celebrities. But also considered for the role of Scott Calvin was Bill Murray, who declined because he didn't want to do another holiday movie after Scrooged in 1988.
This one's better than Scrooged. Sorry about it.
It's a good take. I stand with you on that one. And then Chevy Chase was offered the role, and he declined for scheduling reasons. Which, you know, in the timeline we're in now, we look back and go, oh, that's better for everybody.
That's better for everybody. Yeah.
Let him have Christmas Vacation, right?
Yeah,
Let that be his category.
That dose of Chevy Chase is about all that we should ever take in at the holiday season. Like, I really do.
Yeah, if you wonder what we're talking about, just do a quick little Google search for Chevy Chase these days. It'll be a fun ride for you.
Yeah.
Tom Selleck.
I don't think
the mustache man himself.
Definitely not. No.
Robin Williams.
Yeah, that would have been crazy and kind of fun. But
yeah, can you picture Robin Williams ultimately as like the comforting, loving presence of Santa Claus? You think he could have pulled that off?
All you have to do is watch Patch Adams, and then you can answer that yes.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Tom Hanks.
I mean,
so, you know, we could have had the other side of Toy Story.
It would have been a little more straightforward, but still good.
And Mel Gibson.
Yeah, I mean, I think
for him in that time, that would have been
at that time that could have fit. That's probably the closest to Tim Allen's performance, I think.
Feel like Mel Gibson takes himself just a little too seriously, though. I picture some of those scenes of like his transition of like becoming Santa Claus in everyday life, and I go, I don't know if Mel Gibson's that kind of goofy.
I mean, no better choice than Tim Allen. This is
We're biased
absolutely
because
perfect
it's what
for
we
him.
know, but you think about it and kind of try to put somebody else in there.
You can.
And it really is just perfect casting.
Yeah. This is such a great role that you could see other people doing it well. But for him, it's just the center of the bullseye. This is one of the reasons why it's a classic.
Sarcastic energy that he brings, just like that, like aggressive passiveness of it, I think is the right way to say it.
But you never lose the sight of him as a family person.
Yes.
He can do that without losing that aspect.
So this movie, when it came out, made $145 million domestically and $45 million internationally for a total of $190 million. Not too shabby for a Christmas movie. And then that starts off what becomes a series of Santa Claus movies. 2 more movies, in fact, and then now actually a show on Disney Plus that came out in 2022. I have not seen that. I had no interest in that at the time, personally.
We would go so far as to say that the new show is not canon. It's not part of it. It's not
so you've seen it?
Well, I think we watched as much as we could bear, but it's the same reason why I don't watch anything.
That is a tough take to hear right there. We watched as much as we could bear.
Yikes, yikes, yikes.
Say no more.
It's the same reason why I don't watch any of the Supermans. When I was a kid, Superman was super important to me, like the Sunday night show or whatever. And like,
no way.
I would come down, I'd have a cape on, we'd watch it. It was great. But I refuse to watch any of the renditions beyond that, just because I want to leave where it is in my little nostalgic childhood brain. So in the same way, it's like I would be hesitant to open.
Don't ruin your childhood memories. Keep Simon in his bubble.
Even we will watch the second one occasionally, but the third one even is kind of pushing our boundaries on like, is this good? Is this worth it?
Yeah. This movie has a 73% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, and if you can believe it or not, the audience score comes in lower at 66%, which is super surprising to me.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to attribute to that, just besides you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, I guess.
What they say is this film's utterly undemanding, but it's firmly rooted in the sort of good old-fashioned holiday spirit missing from too many modern Yuletide films. I'm like, oh, I like that. I really appreciate that.
That's
it
good.
Is that good old-fashioned holiday spirit. It does absolutely have that energy.
And to be fair, I think when you're looking for a Christmas movie that you want to watch over and over again, it can't be too demanding.
That's true. Like
movies
any comfort
that are
TV show you're going to turn on before bed, right?
Yes.
Like, you can't send me down the thriller lane here.
No. And the conflict is never too high. It's never too stressful. Like, it's a good comfort Christmas movie, and that's what we need this time of year. and other times of year in my case.
So before we go any further, Simon, help us dial back the clock to 1994 with a synopsis, an overview, a pun-filled journey through the Santa Claus.
The Santa Claus follows the story of Scott Calvin, played by Tim Allen, a divorced dad who's not exactly on the nice list. But when he accidentally causes Santa to fall off his roof on Christmas Eve, Scott finds himself in a clause for concern. He's unwittingly signed up to be the new Santa. And after putting on the red suit, he's whisked away with his son Charlie to the North Pole, where he learns about the fine print of the Santa Claus, a legal contract that names him as Santa's successor. Feeling a bit claustrophobic, Scott tries to forget about what happened.
No, unstoppable.
But over the next year, he undergoes some jingle belly changes, packing on pounds, growing a fluffy white beard, and developing a strange craving for milk and cookies. These new developments challenge his own disbelief and creates conflict with Charlie's custody. But with Charlie's help, Scott learns to embrace being Santa Claus. And in a Christmas time classic that still slays, we embrace the magic of Christmas and learn that seeing isn't believing, believing is seeing.
All right, Simon, let's talk about some movie magic. Items in this movie that we think just help make it a good story in general that we love nerding out about.
Some of the dialogue and writing for this movie is just so good. I don't know how much of it's improvised by Tim Allen. I don't know how much of it's written in, but there are some moments that I'm just like, oh, that's so funny. I love in particular one of the times like when he's first up on the roof and he says, it must be a gift. And he's looking at the reindeer in the sleigh from the cable company. We're getting the Disney Channel now. Merry Christmas.
That's
Like,
so good. Yeah, one of those for me was, he's not Santa Claus. Well, he was.
Yeah.
The quippiness of this movie is so good.
Yeah.
And I think the
How
really
did it
low
feel,
hanging...
Dad, when he's coming out of the chimney? Felt like America's most wanted.
And I feel like the low hanging fruit here is like anytime Neil walks in the room with Scott Calvin, like
Yes.
I already know like where that's going to go and like
Yes.
what kind of joke he's going to make. And it still works every time.
Also, like the Tim Allen energy, even when the turkey starts on fire in the kitchen, it felt like a Tool Time Taylor moment when he's
Oh
like,
my
that's
gosh.
why you want a
Yes.
high quality fire extinguisher right in your kitchen.
Yeah. Or the simplicity of the line that he delivers perfectly, where it's just, turkey's done.
Yeah.
It's great. Piece of movie magic for me really was the vibe that they established for this movie.
Exactly.
They created this mix of modern technology for the 90s mixed with like these old classic Christmas elements.
Yes.
It really does look and feel like this fantastical workshop in the North Pole. And yet you have elves that have jetpacks. And my personal favorite was that the North Pole has a keypad to get in. And what I love is that it's this old school 90s keypad. Looks like a beeper or a calculator, right? Modern technology for the time. But looking at it, like somehow that makes it almost even better. Like this kind of retro
like the blend
feel
of the
it has
tech
now to that technology. That's fun.
One of the things that I think that you're mentioning is when they're in the sleigh and he's like going through all the buttons and stuff. You got a two-way radio in your hat. You've got cookie cocoa dispenser, all that stuff baked into the
Like
sleigh.
snow
It's
radar.
great. Yes. It's the right amount of touch to that. It's good.
Another piece of movie magic for me is just the Santa magic of his bag in the fireplace, just as elements in this movie.
Yeah.
The idea that like his bag is what allows him to fly and it floats. Like, it doesn't have a personality, but you feel like it almost could, kind of like a magic carpet type deal. But the fact that it's part of the magic, that the bag's what's going to get you from A to B, from the sleigh to the house. And then I
they
remember
also
watching...
did some bag magic when he had it on the floor and had to grab the canoe out of it.
Oh yeah,
the
you're
hole in
pulling
the
it
floor.
from I Love It or Leave It.
Yeah, it's great.
That was one of those moments I loved. I loved. Even just because you can think through what that took practically on set to pull off, right? We're going to build a set where this canoe is underneath him, and then he's going to pull it up through the bag.
Yes.
And pull it up into the room, and then have this like slapstick comedy scene of trying to set it up against the tree and have it fall down. And then
the second part of that I love is like when he sets it up against the wall, you can see it clearly get tugged by somebody up above. Like it's you don't see their hand, but you see like it's not just like a slow,
it's not a
like
natural
somebody pushes
movement.
it.
My favorite part of that scene is actually the follow-up bit where he yanks the paddle out of it and then just like throws it on the ground. On top of the canoe. It's great. But out of that magic, the other one I loved is just how the fireplace transforms for people who don't have fireplaces.
Yes.
For me as a kid, that
That's
explained so much for
Yep.
me. That meant so much to me. Because
Mhm.
how often am I thinking through that question as a 6 or 7-year-old,
the-
right?
That was the primary problem, wasn't it? In our generation, where anybody who lived in a newer house, there's no fireplace there.
Yeah.
Gas fireplaces, even when I was younger, weren't like super popular in the way that they are now. So it's just like that was the conundrum. That was the problem you had to solve in the 90s. And the movie magic did it for us, didn't it?
Yeah, it did.
One other piece of movie magic for me, and maybe this is because of where it came out in the time of my childhood, but my image of the classic Santa Claus is Tim Allen's, like the huge length of his beard, the velvet and sewn on embroidered coat and all the stuff.
Yes.
Because of how far they went with his costuming and how like red his makeup and stuff was for that scene towards the end. That's the mental picture for Santa, like the Santa character for me.
I agree. I think it did. It hit me at just the right time in age where that was kind of like the foundational view where I think it made it the most tangible for the first time. And it is such a convincing wardrobe and it looks really, really good.
And I love me some Miracle on 34th Street, like the classic version. But for us in our time, I think for our generation, I think that's the mental picture.
Last piece of movie magic for me really is that I think that the Santa Claus did for the Santa legend, the Santa story, that Spirited did for the Christmas Carol story, the Christmas Carol legend.
Okay, say more.
Right. So Spirited gives you like a new retelling of a story that we know. So we look at the Christmas Carol and we know all the tropes. We know all the pieces and bits and things that go with it enough that we can kind of poke fun at it or give new explanations as to why this is this way. Right.
Yeah.
In the Santa Claus, you have the same thing where we know all of the details about Santa. We know all the things we're supposed to know, like cookies and milk and reindeer and the North Pole and delivering presents and fireplaces and all those things. And the Santa Claus movie allows us to have an explanation to those. They allow us to get a certain interpretation of that story that allows us to reimagine that in a new way. If
It's
you
Santa
talked
for the
about
90s.
Santa, that's right. You would think about it from kind of a 40s picture or a 50s picture from the book The Night Before Christmas. And instead, now a lot of us, especially our generation, pictures more of this Tim Allen version or Scott Calvin version of the Santa Claus, which moved it into its next era or next iteration. And so as I was watching, I was like, "Is this Spirited for Santa?"
That's a good. I can see where you're going there because it is. It's like a refreshment. And Scrooged may have been the Christmas Carol for the 90s, and Spirited is the Christmas Carol for the post-COVID era, right? But Scott Calvin is Santa for the 90s.
All right, Simon, that movie magic is always great. But the reason we're here is because we believe that in all good stories, we have an opportunity to point back to Jesus because God is good. Then, if we're viewing good stories this way, it allows us to find opportunities to make connections, then have more spiritual conversations in our everyday lives.
Yes.
So, Simon, what's the first thing you see in this movie that you think uniquely belongs to Jesus?
I think one of the opportunities for spiritual conversation in this movie is the reason that they give for many people, particularly adults, not believing in Santa. And I think it's really interesting. The answers that they give is because both Laura and Neil go to specific memories that they have. When they were young, they wrote Santa every year, asked him for something particular, and he didn't come through. He didn't deliver. And so then they stopped believing. I think this is an opportunity for a spiritual conversation. I think this is a place in this movie that you could have a moment that belongs to Jesus with somebody who's watching it, because there's so many people that this is one of the primary wrestles of our heart before we come to know who God is. If God was real, if he really cared about me, he would do this thing that I really need, or I really have been asking for. Or if God was really real, if he really cared about me, he wouldn't let this happen to me. And I think that that's a place where I think a lot of people kind of get stuck.
Yeah, it feels like, God doesn't come through in these
Right.
ways.
And I think that when we're having conversations with somebody that might be in that place, it's a hard place to be. And so, like, the empathy that we can have for that wrestle, because we are told that God cares about us. We are told that God listens to our prayers and that anything we ask for in his name, he will give. And I think that those are things that we hear and then we wrestle and, oh man, something doesn't come through the way I expected, or we feel like a prayer goes unanswered. Those are hard things to wrestle with, especially if we have a pretty basic understanding of who God is. And so I think the other things that are in tension with that is like God has a much higher view than we can see. He has a much higher purpose than the things that we have going on in our lives. And he doesn't withhold good things from us. There's a quote from John Newton that has been really important to me at different times in my life when I've kind of felt some of these things. And John Newton is the guy who wrote Amazing Grace. And he says, everything is needful that he sends. Nothing can be needful that he withholds. When I think about
Unpack that real quick. Just needful,
everything
right?
is needful that he sends. So like anything that God sends me, anything that God is doing, good or bad, those things are needful. Even though there may be some hard things in there, there may be some trials. That doesn't mean that God is the source of evil in our lives. That's not what that means. What I'm saying is like the places that he's allowed us to be placed in, the things that we go through, those are things that are needful to his plan and purpose. And he's got a plan for them. And then the second part of that is nothing can be needful that he withholds. And that's the part that I think is the most powerful part of that quote to me. If there's something that I feel, a prayer that has gone unanswered, no matter how much I desire that, God has reasons for that, whether it's a delay, whether it's a denial, like those things are beyond me, but nothing can be needful that he withholds. And so when we come to know God's amazing grace, now John Newton is a guy who went through a lot of stuff. If you ever want to just like look up this guy's story of who's the guy who wrote Amazing Grace and what he went through, there's some pretty amazing things in there. But the amazing grace of God, the free gift that we have, we may not always understand why God does what he does, but that doesn't mean he isn't real, and that doesn't mean that he isn't good. God is always for you. God is not against you. And so even though I think we can have a lot of empathy for somebody who's in that spot, we also have the ability to say, look at all of the stories of people throughout Scripture, can share stories from our own life and say, yeah, I didn't understand what he was doing here, but now I see that what he was doing and it's good. Or we can say, I don't always understand why he does what he does, but I know he's good. I know he's real.
Similar yet different, kind of in this realm of belief. For me, it really kind of called out this reality of keeping a childlike faith. Throughout the movie, we see Charlie first, in particular, being the first one to embrace all these sort of magical and fantastic things that are happening. He believes in everything right off the bat. Of course, he's seeing it, he's experiencing it, it's right in front of him. But man, he walks away from that experience and he's all in. Like, this is who you are, this is what happened, and he can't let it go. And then we see normal everyday kids are also the first to embrace Scott as Santa in his everyday life. They kind of start to pick up on who he is and
they
what
line
he's
up
up
on
to.
the park bench while he's sitting at the soccer game. Yeah,
that's exactly right. That's one of my favorite scenes. Actually, it's like you have that first girl who just looks at him.
So gosh, she's
scoots
so
a
cute.
little closer and literally sits in his lap and says she wants ballet slippers or something. And she just believes who he is.
Yeah.
And I think there's this certain kind of like innocence and open-handedness or trust of these kids' faith in who Scott is, being Santa Claus. And it made me think back to a conversation that Scott had with Judy when he's first at the North Pole. And he's like, I'm way past distressed. I stopped believing in Santa years ago. And she said, yeah, adults, magic just kind of outgrows them. He says, I see it. Yeah, it grows out of them. He goes, I see it, but I don't believe it. And she says, you're missing the point. Seeing isn't believing. Believing is seeing. And kids don't have to see this place to know it's here. They just know.
I love the childlike faith aspect that you're bringing up. Kids don't need to see this place to know that it's here.
And how true is that of our experience with God, right? We don't need to see God to know that he's there, even though, sure, that feels like that would be nice, But I think to Matthew 18:3, where Jesus says, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Trust God with a similar sort of openness and humility that children do, right? Kids do have this inherent trust and belief.
And I think beyond that, also wonder. Like they have tons of questions, but they don't need all of them answered in the way that we do. Like,
Oh, yeah. Or even when the answers don't make sense to them. I could absolutely describe to my daughter why I have to pay taxes. And she'd be like, okay. Like, I have no understanding of that, but I trust you've got it,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just think about that and go, man, how often is that exactly how we should be with God? I could see God on a park bench, right? And I'm going to trust that he's God. And so it's safe to sit in his lap and ask for what I need and ask for what I want because he's God in the same way that I would see my dad on a park bench. And I know I could go sit next to him and go like, hey, I just need to talk to you about what's going on. Or how you doing?
Yeah.
Let's catch up. And I was like, man, there's such a beauty to that kind of like trust, openness, wonder, humility of that. And I was like, oh, we're circling around something pretty cool there in just the way that we see the contrast in particular between these kids and then how Scott even views himself throughout this movie of like having all this sort of disbelief.
They're ahead of him.
Himself.
Yeah, they're ahead of him.
Yes, they are ahead of him in this game. And that is one of my favorite parts of the movie is towards the end where Scott gets to look at Charlie and says, you gave me a wonderful gift. You believed in me when nobody else did. You helped make me Santa. You're the least selfish person I know. And I was like, stab me right through the heart.
Yeah,
like
that's
it was
a great line.
So good.
That's a great line. I think even at one point, Charlie says something along the lines of like, you'll get there.
I know who you are, even if you don't.
Even if you,
And I like to think in some ways, if I were to like turn that in an interesting direction, I like to think that's what God thinks about us, where he's like, I know who you are. Even if you don't, I see the potential in you. I see even the responsibility that you can carry and what you're able to do. And I can see who you're called to be. And he has all the hope in the world that we are going to be and grow into these people, even if he's been denied time over time over time. How many times does Charlie hear, no, even from the person right in the middle with Scott? And he just sticks with it. In the same way, I think God's like, hey, even if you deny me this many times, I know who you can be. I know who I've called you to be. And just you wait. Like I know where you're going to go. And how exciting is that?
When you were talking about that scene with Scott Calvin and Judy, that seeing isn't believing, believing is seeing. I think that line is really the centerpiece of this movie. And I think that that's an opportunity for a spiritual conversation. 100%, because it's in a place where he is literally standing in the North Pole, looking around. I see it, but I don't believe it. And he can't reconcile what's happening there. And I think that line by Judy is so great because there's so much of our faith as followers of Jesus that is unseen. We are placing our faith in unseen things. And the verse that we've quoted on a couple of different occasions, but the definition of faith in Hebrews 11, verse 1, faith is the confidence of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. But that line, more than anything, reminded me of a part of Jesus's story where he's talking to his disciples after he has resurrected, and it's this interaction with Thomas. And Thomas is like, I need more proof. Let me place my hand in the holes in your hands and in your side, and I'll believe. And when Jesus presents himself to him and does that, he falls at his feet. But what Jesus says to him is so interesting. He says, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and have yet believed. That's, I think, the root of this idea that believing is seeing. Instead of Scott Calvin saying, it's just a dream, and Charlie saying, you're in denial. And Scott replies to him, how, Charlie? How do you know? You don't have any proof. He's still in that place and not taking that belief as his sight. And so I think there's so many opportunities throughout the movie where people bring their objections to this belief or this idea of, believing is seeing. And one of my favorite interactions of the whole movie is when Charlie and Neil are talking, and Neil's like, it's not logical. Have you ever seen a reindeer fly? And Charlie says, well, yes. Neil's like, well, I haven't. and then Charlie, do you remember his response here? This is like, even as a kid, I was like, yeah. Because he says, have you ever seen $1 million? And Neil says, no. Well, just because you haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
That's great.
It's a great line. But one thing I wouldn't want this believing is seeing to mean is that we have to suspend our intelligence, that we have to say, oh, well, I just have to not think, and then I can be a Christian, right?
Just leave the details out of it, right? You can't think about it too
there's
much,
no room for logic. There's no room for exploration. No, that's
Christianity's for these people who just they're not critical thinkers. They're just throwing their trust on whatever.
That is not what this believing is seeing means. because I think if you dig into the scripture, Jesus can take your questions. The Bible can take your questions. It can take your scrutiny, but don't stop asking questions. Keep digging in, all of those things. And at some level, there is a point where your intellect and your reasoning will only take you so far. There is still mystery. There is still a point where you have to choose.
Some sort of trust and faith are a part of that equation.
You have to choose whether to believe or not. And then that's kind of the place where you really start seeing the world differently and sensing some of these unseen things that God has for us as followers of Jesus. And so those are things that are just like, I think that that's such a rich place for conversation.
Another one for me is this theme of an unexpected calling. And I would just say, don't be surprised when God calls you into something you're not ready for or maybe not even interested in. Scott Calvin has no intention of being Santa Claus in this movie when it starts out, right? Like, he is happily like this marketing sales dude, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, a dude's on the roof who happens to be Tim Allen's real life stunt double. For the record, the dude on the roof who slips and falls and goes through all that, that is his actual stunt double who got to play that role.
Oh, I love that.
But you could say in some ways, you could draw some connections between like Moses, who had no intention of freeing the Israelites in Exodus. He literally gives excuses and talks about his fear of failure with God. Like, you've got the wrong dude. This is a bad idea.
Yeah.
And God's pretty gracious, but he's like, really? You're going to tell me no? That I picked the wrong person? You know? Or you could go to Saul, who's going in the opposite direction of where God wants him to go, persecuting Christians. And then God, you know, kind of metaphorically threw him off his roof and got him to go the other direction. And I think God does just invite us into new purposes. And it can be magical and transformational and very difficult. Scott's life did not get any easier when he became Santa, right?
No.
It would ease to be like, you're Santa, you've got all this magic, you know, you're doing all these cool things. It is awesome. He's a new person.
More complicated,
but the guy gets arrested. It gets more complicated. But you see his life become richer, fuller, healthier. He's more honest with himself and with his family. And how often is that the story with God where he's like, hey, I am going to transform you from the inside out. I'm going to send you in a new direction. I'm going to give you a new purpose. I'm going to give you a kind of this unexpected calling. And it probably isn't going to be super easy. It's going to force you into places that you may be unwilling to go, that are going to be uncomfortable because you're going to have to face your nightmares, or you're going to have to face your demons, or you have to face whatever. But look at what is on the other side. Look at how you're going to have to grow your trust in me, your connection to me, and how that's going to make all these other things in your life flourish as you walk through that new calling. And I just had those moments that we talk about in this podcast where I was watching the movie and I went, how about that?
Another place in this movie that I think is an opportunity for a conversation is really what the critical question of this movie at the kind of the height of tension, when Charlie and Scott Calvin and Laura and Neil are standing in the house after the whole interaction with the police and all that kind of stuff. They kind of have this, final conflict over whether or not Scott Calvin is Santa Claus. And Charlie is saying to his mom and to Neil, you think you know who he is, but you don't. I know exactly who he is. And Neil and Laura, at that moment, after those conversations, it's almost like they look at him differently, like they look intently at him, and they stop seeing him as just Scott Calvin, but who he is as Santa Claus. I think that the wrestle that Neil and Laura, and even Scott Calvin to some extent, that critical question of who is this person? Is he Santa? That's the central question about Jesus too. People make Jesus out to be a lot of things. He's a wise prophet, a good teacher, loving philosopher, all of those things. But that's not who Jesus claimed he was. Jesus claimed himself to be the Son of God, to be God in the flesh. So there's really no option for any of those common things to ascribe to Jesus. Those really aren't options. C.S. Lewis has this great quote and thing that he talks about in Mere Christianity. Jesus is either a lunatic or a liar, or he is who he says he is, Lord. And those are the only options. And so I think when we think about that in the context of this movie, but in our faith, Jesus has this great moment with his disciples in Luke chapter 9, where he's talking to them in private, and he asks his disciples, who do the crowds say that I am? And they said, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others that you're one of the prophets long ago come back to life. He says, well, what about you, though? Who do you say that I am? And Peter answers, God's Messiah. It's a great moment where it really comes down to who do we believe Jesus is? And just like this moment with Neil and Laura and Charlie in the house, they have to decide, who is this? Who is this really? And when we come up against that question, when we can answer that ourselves, for us with Jesus, it's very clear. It's either that he's crazy and making the claims that he does, or he's a liar and it's just not true who he says he is, or it is. And that means he's the Lord. There's no wiggle room here. So when you look at the person of Jesus, it really all comes down to who he is. And so I think that that's a rich place for conversation sparked off of this movie, is to be able to kind of ask somebody, okay, well, who do you say he is?
So those are some great pictures of where we see Jesus in this story, in this good story. But let's get really practical. Let's get to the so what of it all. If we were to walk away from here and actually start to put some of these concepts we're talking about into practice, what might they start to sound like?
A lot of times having spiritual conversations, either in the midst of a movie that we're watching or, in response to it afterwards, the hardest part is just getting the entry point into the conversation.
Yeah, how do I start that conversation?
How do I get this started?
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And so I think some of the things for me is just like, what are those entry lines or sentences that might spark that conversation? What are the right questions to ask? Because I think more than anything, when you're having a spiritual conversation with somebody, the best posture is to be curious of any age.
I was just thinking that. Yes, stay curious.
Right.
Yes.
Stay curious in this. So whether you're talking to, your 5-year-old, or whether you're talking to a teenager, whether you're talking to a grown adult that you're watching a movie with, you're wanting to have a spiritual conversation, that posture of curiosity is a great place to start. So finding the right question to open up those conversations, I think, is key. And I think you can ask the question with this: seeing isn't believing, believing is seeing. And one of the questions you can ask is like, well, what are some things that you believe in that you can't see, or that you haven't seen, that you still believe in? There might be some silly answers to that question, but there also may be some things that would surprise us. And I think anytime that we can give our kids or people that we're with an opportunity to just react to some of those questions, you just never know how that question might lead to another one and another one. And you might just find your way through this kind of curious question in the midst of a conversation about real things, about spiritual things. And that is a great place for us to have a conversation about Jesus.
Yeah, another one for me is going, how can I connect their real life experience that does not involve Jesus necessarily to an experience that does involve Jesus? And so thinking about, has there ever been a time where you had to do something you didn't want to do, but you knew you had to do it? That is a question I'm going to have to ask my future 4, 5, 6-year-old someday, right? Because ultimately, there's going to be a point where I'm going to ask you something you do not want to do.
Yes.
And that as an adult, there will be things you do not want to do, but you've got to do it anyway. And so that's like a real life thing I want my kids to think about and learn.
And you're tying this to how like Scott Calvin had to do something that he didn't want to do?
Yes.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Right.
And then going, is there a way that sometimes that God's asking you to do things you don't want to do? And I'm picturing a 6-year-old, like sometimes I know I need to pray and I'm tired. It could be something simple like that. Or it's, hey, I know I need to be nice to my classmate and they're mean to me. I don't want to be nice. Oh, okay. Well, what does God say about that, right? Like, what is it that God wants you to do, right? You can kind of start to build these connections. Again, just being curious. You kind of let them fill in the answers and then kind of roll with it from there. But for me, that has been super helpful. It's just going, okay, how do I make a connection that is general enough? The thing goes like, hey, what if we kind of twist that just a little bit to go, hey, you experience like that with God, and then let it go from there.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think another opportunity for a spiritual conversation, I know every family does this differently in terms of dealing with Santa and all that kind of things. But when you're having the real conversations about Santa and the reality of that story, the degree to which that story is true, I think that that's a place for a spiritual conversation, because I think the big thing not to miss is that there are stories that are true and real, and there are stories that are not and are made up and are part of our Christmas season. But whenever we kind of pull the rug out at whatever point that happens or whatever point of clarity you give, it's really, I think, important to have that conversation of like making sure that you're telling them the story of Jesus is real. There's no reveal coming later. This is a real story. This has real impact in our lives. We can believe in Jesus and know that he is here. He is real. He is alive. He's active in our life. mom and dad believe in Jesus, the story is real, and don't miss that opportunity to drive those things home. Because I think just like anytime we find out something new in our childhood that maybe we thought was different, it can call into question other things. And particularly with this one, around Christmas time, when they're hearing both of these stories at the same time, I think it's a really important place for a spiritual conversation with your kids.
Yeah, instead of viewing it as something you're going to dread or be nervous or scared about, right? I think there's plenty of things to do intentionally there.
Yeah.
You can really start to view that as an opportunity to go, how might I set this up as an experience, as an opportunity, or maybe even, for lack of a better term, almost a handoff of saying like, hey, in the midst of this one thing you're learning, here's something you can lean into more. Here's the thing that we
here's
something
that we want you to know even more that we don't.
Here's how the story of Jesus helps inspire these other stories of Christmas.
Oh, totally.
That we are connected to and latch on to. And so where can we then see Jesus in these other stories and legends of the Christmas season that are going to help connect those in both directions?
Yes.
All right, Simon Campbell, it is time for some Love It or Leave It. An opportunity to talk about what we loved and what we could have done without along the way. And my very first one for you, Simon, is Love It or Leave It. The ladder that comes from the one and the only, the Rose Suchak Ladder Company.
I love this so much because I think all of us have at some point been listening to a story as a kid being read to us, and we jumble the words together differently than what they appear on the page, and we make up a word or make up something that happens. I did this with song lyrics as a kid too. That's what's happening here. And to have that represented in a movie and on the plaque of the ladder when it comes down as it hits him in the head. Oh, it's great. Yeah.
And I love the justice of it all too, because Charlie asked that question earlier.
Yes.
He's like, what's a clatter? Yeah. You know, he's like, oh, no, it's clatter. You know, it's this. And he kind of like answers it, but also kind of like brush him off. I feel like this great like justice moment. He turns around and bam, that literally hits him right in the face, which is so good.
Okay, this is a part I'm really interested to see what you think on this, because I think this could be a divisive point for a lot of viewers of this movie.
This is so exciting.
The animatronic reindeer in this movie, you know, where you fall on this?
I was going to ask you this question in a similar yet different way, not necessarily like the animatronic angle, but just like how they've characterized the reindeer in this movie. That's my question. Like, love it, leave it, just like the characterization, particularly of Comet, is what we get here.
Yes.
And my first take is that I absolutely leave it. I hate this part of this movie.
Okay.
This is my least favorite part of the Santa Claus
tell me why.
movie.
What is it that you don't like about the
reindeer? They are too cartoony for me. As if you're going to lean into making all of this real and jumping into all this, give me more realistic reindeer. I let them just be reindeer. Make them a little more regal. Make them a little more respected. Like one of the first things we get out of Comet is like a fart joke. Like Comet farts, and I hate that. That is that turns me off immediately. And then they have like this. They make all these faces, and I'm like, this looks very unsettling to me. Kind of they give them like this grungy, kind of dopey sort of like.
And the thing
vibe
is
to them.
like I don't think it was as egregious in the first one. It goes off the rails in the second one. They totally lose me in the second. They lean to them
kind of like Minion-esque characters.
Yeah, like this reindeer in the second one. It's like doing this jumbled, like kind of like a Scooby-Doo
like
sort of talking to you.
Kind of thing.
It's awful. It's awful.
Oh no. And so this was a hard pass for me, even in the first.
Yeah.
Doesn't help that we just watched the movie Claus, which has these super majestic looking reindeer in the distance that are silent, and they just look up and they're just staring, you know?
That's great.
When you look at them, they're almost intimidating, right?
Oh, yeah.
And like reindeer in real life, they are big. They are intimidating and very regal creatures. And I'm like, what a disservice that they've done in this.
Yeah.
How dare they?
Okay, there's this moment in the conference room where he's going to have this big meeting, and I have to know what you think about this. When they orders all of his stuff and they bring the food, the Jeopardy theme, the use of the Jeopardy theme in the middle of that scene, is that a love it or is that a leave it for you?
I think because of the time in which it takes place, it's a love it. That had to have been like in the center of the bullseye for the 90s culture of the time.
Yes.
To get that song, I think it works really well, actually.
Good.
And the fact that it has like the bum, bum, bum,
that's
like beats at the end.
Exactly what I was going to say.
The
that they used all of it and hit the bum bum after the little clicks of the spoon in the hot fudge dish.
There's like a certain choreography to that. That's great. Simon, love it or leave it that Scott Calvin's Ho 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 sounds just like Tim the Toolman Taylor.
Yes, I love that. I love everything about it because that is what he brings to this. And I think it's so unique because you're saying if this was his first movie, really, like bringing some of Tim Taylor is great.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the right touch. It feels like
great.
home when I hear it.
Yeah.
Okay, my last love it or leave it for you, Simon, is love it or leave it. Santa just seemingly like being revealed at the end of the movie in front of everyone at Laura and Neil's house.
Oh, yeah. When they have the police line out and all the kids are out there and everything. And like, yep. Oh, cool. He's in plain sight. I get so distracted by all like the little elf characters that are scattered in the crowd. Like, and I was like, oh, that's an elf. That's an elf. So I kind of miss the fact that like, oh yeah, well, this is sort of just putting it out there in the open.
Well, help me answer that real quick. I've never understood why are there elves there, right?
I don't know.
Is that part of like the elves team, right? That like they changed clothes,
maybe it's
you know?
A little like there's like an angels among us kind of thing. It's like
that's a huge leave it for me now that you said it out loud. Because like I was watching the movie, I'm like, why are they here? Like, how did you get here? Like, what is the purpose?
Never explained.
You couldn't help at all in this situation right now. No,
yeah,
okay. No, they just run away. Like, and no parent in the crowd is like, where are the children going without parents? You know, like it's
like
clearly the neighborhood showing up, and everyone's like, I've never seen this kid. You know?
Yeah, no kidding.
Leave that part. But my main point remains. That was a part that my wife looked at me and literally said, why does he keep circling the house?
Yeah.
Comes by with the sleigh 3 separate times.
Yeah.
There's like the initial reveal.
Yeah.
And then there's him dropping off the gifts. And you're like, oh, cool. And then they show like one more shot where he's just like doing a slow flyby in front of the house.
They had to get their money's worth for the animation for that.
I guess, man.
Yeah. Okay, I'm genuinely interested, and I really don't have a dog in this fight, but there's a scene towards the end of the movie. It's a montage where the police are going to start looking for him, but at the North Pole, they're all coming out. Tim Allen's in his full Santa getup, and there's like smoke and stuff.
He's
and
in his new flame retardant suit, and they literally like have a dance. They do like a thing.
What do you think about like the walkout for that?
Yeah,
is that a love it or leave it
that
for
they
you?
Play there? What is that?
Give me all your lovin'. I think is what it is. But what's interesting about that is they add sleigh bells to it.
No way.
They do. They add sleigh bells to it for the whole thing, which automatically Christmasifies anything.
That is so much of a love it because it's audacious and doesn't really make sense in a way that
it
works for me.
Yeah.
I think the fact that they layer it over Santa and the elves getting ready, but also the cop cars arresting another Santa.
Yes.
It's just like these contrast of energies is so great.
But did you like the walkout and the pausing?
I literally had never caught that until I watched it this time.
Really?
And I was like, oh, that's funny.
It is funny.
I think it works. Too. It's a little nonsensical. Why are they doing that? I don't know, but I'm willing to let it go because I think it's good.
Okay, because it's one of my favorite lines in the movie, I need to ask you this last one. So when he's shaving his beard, he's dyeing his hair, and then it all grows back at once. Is that a love it or a leave it for you? The effect of that and the sound, it kind of sounds like, and it like
that's a love it. Yeah. I have always loved that. Even as a kid, that was like the most fascinating. I couldn't look away from that.
I know they did it so good. They did it so good.
Wonder to it, right? For me, it was always the disconnect of like, this is obviously happening. Why does he keep trying this? At this point, but the fact to show how it just keeps getting more extreme. Like, I think it's great. I think it's really fun, and what a great use of the technology of the time, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure that was a lot of work in 1994.
I don't know how they accomplished that, but the line afterwards is just like so good.
Well, Simon, all good things must come to an end, including this episode.
Thanks again for joining us for episode 20. We hope it's been a fun one for you, but our greatest desire is that this is doing for you what it's doing for us, shaping the way we watch movies and sparking spiritual conversations about them.
And we would love to keep the conversation going with you because we know there are all sorts of other good stories and awesome nuances to explore. And you can track us down to talk about your thoughts, insights, and questions on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, even YouTube at All Good Stories Podcast. We would love to keep the conversation going and keep learning from you. This has been really fun over now 20 episodes. We have loved being able to do this, and sincerely, we have loved being able to connect with you along the way as you've either been inspired or challenged or have just been around for fun and said, "Oh, that was neat. Thanks for your support. It's meant a lot to us."
And remember, all good stories belong to Jesus.
And if you choose to give your story to Jesus, you can be sure he'll make it a good one.